Hey guys and girls, Nathan Birch here from the B.Invested office. Just want to do a token shout out, and this might be coming very, people will be sitting there going, why is Nathan thanking all these people? They are a fucking mess. They're bad people. I just want to thank people for doing what they do, or if they even are people. But anyway, it's a different topic. So I just want to do a bit of an appreciation shout out to some major characters of the world. So I wanted to do the first one. I wanted to thank JP Morgan for crashing the currency and suppression over silver. I want to thank Bill Gates, Fauci, and Klaus Schwab for making the scamdemic in 2020 and using that as an excuse to kill the economy and to hijack humanity. Right? I see through your evil plot. It's pretty cool. I wish I'd have thought it myself. None of us could have. We're not fucked up like that. But thank you for bringing this to us. I'd like to thank Henry Kissinger and President Nixon, for taking the world off the gold standard and debasing our currency from the Bretton Woods system to the petrodollar, going back in 1971. For those of you that don't realise, on the 15th of August, coming up in a few months, it will be 50 years since this big scam had occurred, right? And if you look at everything since then, everything's gone up in value since the 1970s, right? So if it wasn't for these two criminals plus all the people that are behind it, we wouldn't be able to play the game that we play, and I wouldn't be able to live my life the way that I do, because we wouldn't have such a scam and everybody to have access to that. So I'd like to thank Jerome Powell, Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke for killing the US currency and for printing lots of dead, sort of currency nodes to be able to, create massive inflation. Because if it wasn't for those guys, we wouldn't see all these stimulus packages. If it wasn't for the central banks and turning their monetary policy around, we wouldn't be able to see all this cheap, easy credit, right? I'm not a banker. I'm not a fan of the banker. I just want to do an appreciation, because credit where credit's due. If we didn't have this scammy fucking system and a bubble that we live in, we wouldn't be able to play the games that we play. I'd like to thank, whether it be Trump or Obama or Bush or Biden or Clinton, all the prime ministers around the world for being good, submissive puppets, for being the middle management of this system, for being the caretaker, being the spokespeople for the the ruling parties, being the central banks and various interests that control them. I'd like to thank BlackRock for owning all the companies out there. Every company you see, the 156 companies that rule the world, and they're like a good sort of like 5, 10, 20% ownership of each and every one of those companies. Go and check out any of the US stocks out there and look at who the shareholders of them are, and you'll see that it's a common name out there. So I'd like to thank them for whatever contribution they play. Now, I don't know. I'd like to thank all the media for manipulating the shit out of everything and controlling everybody, because if you weren't able to, I wouldn't be able to see the fun in the world and being able to live life on my terms, knowing that you're going to fuck up the currency, you're going to create inflation like never seen beforehand. Thanks a lot for being a part of that. I'd like to thank this said scamdemic that we've had for allowing us the opportunity to people to wake up and question things, because it's gone beyond a joke now. People are really starting to question and be awake and aware that the system is a fucked up system. So I want to thank that. I'd like to thank those people that have little symbols for their family crests at the top of the food chain. They know who they are. They control the central banks, have been controlling humanity for hundreds of years, if not thousands, but the different sort of bloodlines that control us. I'd like to thank them as well. I'd like to thank for all the psyops to control and suppress, because if it wasn't, it wouldn't leave opportunities. I'd really like to do a special shout out to a war criminal. It was one of the presidents of America, Woodrow Wilson, for in 1913 signing over the US dollar to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers by creating the Federal Reserve in the US, and then later that becoming the base currency for the rest of the world. So without them, it wouldn't have allowed for Nixon and Henry Kissinger back in 1971 to create this scam. And yeah, with it, I actually was going to print out a lot of charts, and I'm going to add these charts to the screen and get the editor to go over, and let's have a look at some of these charts. So as we can see here on the first slide, we're looking at Sydney house prices and Melbourne house prices over the period of the last, let's call it 100 years, 120 years. So this is data from Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it only goes up to the year 2010. And I find it very strange that it says Melbourne is higher, but if we look at it now, markets don't move, in line with each other. They're very counter-cyclical. But if we look at Melbourne and Sydney, we can see just at that period of time that's where things were. But what I take note of is if we look at the line from 1880, which is at 100 there on the left, all the way through to 1950, which was the Industrial Revolution, the prices remain relatively flat. The money got debased back in 1930 in the Confiscation Act of 1933, and it didn't happen until around 1970. So I want to direct our eyes over to 1970 because it was the 15th of August 1971 that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger that I talked about beforehand have debased all the currency. So we went off a thing called the Bretton Woods system, and we went onto the petrodollar, which is basically where we see in 1970, which is where that trend line from $100,000 or $100,000 there in 1970 break away and start taking its big leap up. So that was a very crucial year, and we started seeing squiggly lines all the way up, but then we went up in 1990 before we saw another crash. So 20 years it took us to go from 100 to 200, and then we saw the recession we had to have, which in the year 2000, so 10 years passed, and we saw the market go from 200 up to 300, and then in and around sort of 2011, 2012, the property market in Sydney caught back up and took off, and the rest is history. So if we look there, we're going to see the first slide being the ABS statistics showing that the market absolutely did nothing up until around the 1950s. It got a slight pump up, and then it went all the way up ever since. If we look at the second slide here, and this is why I say that it is purely a debt-based Ponzi scheme that we are living in today. If we look at this second chart, which is once again the source from ABS statistics, from the year 1800 through to the 1930s, you could see that there was no household debt. Like the household debt levels were very low to 1%, 2%, whatever that would equal to be. If we see what happened around the end of the Great Depression, we started going into levels of debt towards war. We had a lot of war and World War I, World War II that came back down in 1950s. Once again, if we look at these charts, they all tell the same message. So 1951 up until about 1971, it jumped quite significantly. Household debt over that period of time, there was a 20-year period, went from 0% or 1%, 2%, whatever, all the way up to 20% debt to GDP level. Then if we look at 1971, we had the first sort of 10 to 20 years worth of our monetary system, because the dollar that we used was really only established in 1971. So 1981 went through, we saw a bit of quite high levels of inflation through the 1970s, 1980s, and then as we hit the late 1980s and 1990s, we ended up in the recession that we had to have. And what did they do at that period of time? They just printed money. And then the household debt, you can see this is pretty much a straight line all the way up to 2011, and these charts are really only up until now. Like there's a lot of chart that's missing here, but I just want us to see the picture, because as we lay these charts over each other, we can see how big of a scam the whole fabric of society really is. As we go to chart number 3 here, we can see the housing price index, and this is from 1880 to 2012. So once again, looking at what we saw beforehand from 1880 all the way up to 1950, did nothing. Then 1950 it spiked, everyone started getting a house and a car. Then in 1970, that's where the real fun started. We can see the chart starts to spike, went through a level of inflation through the 1970s and 80s, and then we started to see the money printers start to die. And each level of these little booms, so the boom in the early 90s here, which was flawed, that was all from monetary policy. Then we look in the early 2000s, that was the dot-com era. Then we see the GFC, nothing really happened. And ever since the GFC, things have gone skyrocket, which we don't see on this chart. So there are three charts from Australia. As we go on to chart number 4, this is where things get really fun, because people say, it's just in Australia, Nathan, this has happened, whatever. House prices in Australia might be unaffordable. But if we start looking here at chart number 4, this is UK, England, Wales, Scotland, the whole sort of, UK sort of area. We've got here in 1970 onwards, this is where I could find the chart from. So don't shoot me that it wasn't beforehand. These charts are difficult, but when we start overlaying them, they all show the same sort of images. And these are the house prices in pounds, which are going astronomical, and they're getting higher and higher. But for the 100 years beforehand, they were not rising. They only rose when we started manipulating money. Up until 1970, the house price in the UK or in England was only sort of 20 to 30,000 pound. Then in the 1980s, it went up to 25,000 pound. Then in the 1990s, that's when things started to really separate. We went through the early 2000s, up to the 2000s, and we saw the dot-com bubble, heaps of money printing. Things started to rise. See the GFC, it goes back a little bit, but then with all the money printing from the GFC, QE1, QE2, QE3, Operation Twist, they're all things out there. Go and research what these were. We started seeing the property prices rise at an astronomical greater gradient. And then if we were to overlay that with 2020, 2021 and onwards, we're going to see massive levels of growth / inflation due to the level of debt in this great debt bubble that we've created. We're going to be heading through a hyperinflationary depression. Moving on to slide number 5. This one is very, very clear, looking at UK house prices. If we look here, house prices in pound all the way up to 1970, it will remain flat. Then in 1970, we see a little bump up. Then from 1970 to the 80s, we see large level of growth. We see the 90s come. We see the recession that we had to have. I thought the recession that we had to have was blamed on Paul Keating, the Prime Minister of the time in Australia. Everyone blamed this guy for fucking up our nation. But why did the same thing happen in the UK, where we've got the house prices going backwards up until monetary policy changes in the late 90s, and then we start seeing great levels of house prices. The house prices rise, they go backwards for a decade from 60,000 to sort of 50,000. Then we start seeing in a period of like 2, 3, 4 years, the house price goes up to £160,000. And then, this only goes up to 2015, but it's much higher now. Why did this happen? How did only a couple of years, things rise? Because it is manipulation of our currency. So we go to chart number 6 here, and we look at, the chart. This is in the US, right? So this is Los Angeles. We can see here in 1900 to about 1933, nothing ever happened. In and around 1948 to 1950, what happened then? That was the Industrial Revolution. House prices doubled within a period of 3 years. It's not even a blip on a map here. Then we start seeing all the way through into the 1970s, and we haven't even entered into $20,000 territory on that bottom line. We've got the change of our currency in 1971. And then very quickly from 1970 to 1980, the house price doubled. So in 1 decade in the US, these charts, just remembering that, these charts are all different countries all around the world. But in 1970, the price doubled within the 10 years. Why did it double? And then we look at the next 10 years from 1981 to 1991, the house prices gone up, doubled again. It was actually tripled, gone up to 100,000. So it's gone up from 1970 to 1980. It's gone up from $20,000 to $40,000, and then from 1980 to 1990, it's gone all the way up to 100,000. So how come it is rising at such a great rate? Then in 1990, the market shits itself and goes all the way back until the dot-com bubble. It's gone back by about 20%, and that's why I've always talked about buying properties below 20% below market value, because then it protects you from these sort of problems. Then in a period from 1990 all the way up to 2005, just pre-GFC, property prices went up to almost $300,000, and then they crashed because of the GFC. But what happened is they printed so much money, and these charts only go up to 2012. But if we look and overlay the charts of what's happening in the property market now, you will see that this has gone up astronomical. So that is now that we've covered off in Australia, we've covered off in Europe, in the UK, we've now got the US, and we've got every single country around the world. If we look at China, we'll look at Philippines, we'll look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's a different story. Let's look at New Zealand. Let's look at fucking Africa. Right? There's newspaper articles about Kenya having house prices unaffordable. If you overlay these charts, which the charts are a little bit sketchy, these things are showing a very, very similar picture. And it is all due to the levels of manipulation and fraud in the financial system. And I'm just going to take us to our last chart, which is chart number 7. It's got absolutely fuck all to do with property. Now, this is to do with silver prices. And if we want to talk about a market that's fully manipulated, don't even get me started on this one. But if we look at the price of silver, it's between around $1 and maybe $1.50 all the way up until 1970. The price never hit $5. But then in 1970, we saw that price go instantly to $5. Remembering in 1966 here in Australia, we went from the imperial system to the metric system, and went from the pounds and the pence to the dollars and the cents, and we changed our currency. And at 1966, we lost all of our precious metal inside our currency, meaning that it wasn't tied to any gold or silver or anything like that. So remembering that these prices are based in US dollars, and it's not in Aussie dollars, but that's what they base this on, because in 1971 they took us off the Bretton Woods system and hijacked our currency, being those two people that I mentioned beforehand, and certain vested interest in companies and corporations, and these things have been heavily manipulated. So then we saw the price start to run away. And do you remember how we had runaway inflation in the mid-80s, and we saw interest rates go up to sort of 10, 15, 20%, all those sorts of things that everyone talks about of good old days? We saw the price of this metal go all the way up to $40, $50 it actually hit, and then it came all the way back down because it's been artificially suppressed, and it's been kept very, very stable for a long period of time, and a few spikes where it's run away. But what else do we know that is less in 2021 than what it was back in 1980? Fuck all, because everything's been inflated away. But we have a market here which is the precious metal markets, which is very, very heavily manipulated. And that is the reason why I showed you all these charts and showing you, this the precious metals, is because I've been asked many a time what would happen if we went back to a gold standard. And the reality of it is if we went back to a gold standard and have precious metals such as silver and copper and gold in our currency, the money did nothing for 100 years prior. So without them manipulating the currency, without them manipulating the precious metals markets, without them manipulating other financial instruments, we wouldn't be able to have the house price growth and all the cool things that we're seeing here. So when I started this video, and I wanted to thank all of these pricks that are, have been able to help us, they're bad people. There's lots of bad things that have happened and gone on. However, there has been a lot of game. If they didn't manipulate this market, we wouldn't have the opportunity. So we need to understand what is happening in the financial space. We need to understand what's happening with the fraud and manipulation in the financial system. And then we can sort of prognosticate and look forward into the future to see what the opportunity is for us to be able to have success. So on that note, guys and girls, thanks a lot for listening to this and watching my rant.
If it wasn't for all of this coming together,
we wouldn't have seen 50 years of massive inflation. As we just saw in those charts, the inflation has been rampant. We wouldn't have been able to see those moves occur if it wasn't for all of these bullshit, communist, fucking criminal, middle management people, creatures, bad people, right? I know I talk a lot of shit about you guys, right? I know I'm like, you guys are fucking evil and real bad, right? However, I just want to show a token of appreciation that without all this shit occurring, without our currencies being manipulated for the last 50 years, which is very evident, right? You might have thought at the start of this video, Nathan's a bit whacked up, what's he going on about? But when you saw those charts, there's no way of saying that this isn't a fucking scam, right? So I just wanted to thank everybody for playing their role in that. And just from my side, I just want to say thank you for everybody who's been watching and following me talking about this and exposing it since 2017. I copped a lot of shit. I got blacklisted from the media and people talking bad things about me because I started to speak out about their system, about how the currency works, how we're going into a depression, how we're going to see inflation. And I just, appreciate and thank you guys. That's the one I really care about. The rest of them is just more of a joke because I've created such a wonderful environment. Without having this manipulation, we wouldn't be able to have this growth and this false, security that we've got such a great economy and all that sort of stuff. So, for everyone that's played their role, thanks a lot. But most importantly, thanks a lot for for being there and watching and watching all this shit go down. It's been fun. I remember in the start of 2020, I was laughing with one of my mates that works in the B.Invested organization because I'm so glad I'm going through this period of time with you because we can have some fun, have some laughs, and enjoy things that are happening because there's so many great opportunities. So just want to thank everybody out there, really. Have a great day. Bye for now.